Hello, and welcome to Groundbreakers with Charles and Alice Dagit. Hi, I'm Alice. Groundbreakers is a show about the history of American architecture and specifically how it's been shaped by the American dream, the American character which simply bursts with ingenuity and invention. In this series, we're discovering the ways in which architects and their designs have been molded by our culture, our economics, our environment, our social and political fabric. We go from place to place through a timeline to show how these influences indelibly shaped our architecture that surrounds us today. This is the American story of the innovation and entrepreneurial spirit that has created our architectural treasures. We hope that as you walk around your towns and cities, you will look up with renewed curiosity and ask, how come? Previously, we examined the formulaic plantation houses of Virginia, that country's capital Williamsburg, and the neoclassical architecture of Thomas Jefferson. We then contrasted them with the far more quirky residences of Annapolis, Maryland. We then looked at how the Civil War dramatically fueled innovation, and we looked specifically at Philadelphia and Boston, where two enormously groundbreaking architects, Frank Furness and H.H. Richardson, completely rejected tradition and pioneered in startling new directions. Next, we visited Chicago to view the paradigm-shifting work of Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright. Then on to the West Coast, where Pasadena and San Francisco were fed by the brand new cross-continental railroads. A further innovation in travel, the automobile, then powered the careers of Eero Saarinen in Detroit, Bruce Goff in Tulsa, and Rudolf Schindler in Los Angeles. When we headed back to the East Coast, we explored the International Style, the Philadelphia School, and the New York Five, including Richard Meyer and Michael Graves. Now today we'll look at architects who practice throughout the country and indeed the world. And we'll finish with the architects of the bizarre. Yes, Los Angeles' Eric Owen Moss and Frank Gehry. Brace yourselves for them. We have with us award-winning architect Charles Dagit, who holds Pennsylvania's coveted gold medal of distinction. A member of the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects, Charles has won over 60 national, regional, and local design awards. And he has written a fascinating book on this very subject. Welcome, Charlie. What are you going to tell us about today, as fascinating as other weeks?
Well, today we're looking at the very contemporary architects that we have around us now, as opposed to late in history. So the first one is Jim Polczak, who became Dean of Columbia Architecture School and did a number of important buildings. He did work in New York, of course, because he was from New York, and he did the Rose Center there, which is a huge glass building with a huge ball in it of the world, and it's a kind of a museum. He also did the Clinton Library in Little Rock, Arkansas. He did the Museum building, which is a museum. He did another museum here in Philadelphia, the American Jewish Museum. Right? And he did a building called the Inventors Hall in Cleveland. And then we're looking at Peter Boland. And Peter is a contemporary of mine and a competitor. And I've known him for a long, long period of time. He was very active in the AIA Committee on Design, as I was. And recently he received the AIA Gold Medal for his work. And his work is quite interesting because it borders to a certain degree on the serene. His first house was a house for his parents. And many architects do their own houses. Peter did one for his parents. It's a beautiful house in Connecticut in a gorgeous setting, and sort of startled the architectural world in its simplicity. It's a very beautiful building. He did a complex for the Girl Scouts. He's from Wilkes-Barre, by the way, originally. And interestingly enough, his commissions caused him to create offices all around the country. So he has an office in in Seattle because he won the competition to do Bill Gates' house.
Oh my goodness.
And it is an extraordinary building. The house itself is 7 stories tall.
Oh, you're kidding.
And it's built on a mountainside facing Washington Lake. And it's a gorgeous location. And the back wall of the house is 7 stories tall.
Gee.
And it's a huge retaining wall. And it's his wine cellar. And it's fed by an elevator, so he can reach the bottles.
So the retaining wall stays nice and
Yes.
cool.
But it's a serene building. It's a building made up of poured in place concrete, granite block, and Douglas fir. They purchased a whole timber mill and milled all of the. First, they used the millwork of the mill to do the formwork of the concrete, and then he used they sent it back to the mill and refined it and
Oh, my
used it for the
goodness.
structure.
Talk about, well, being creative
recycling.
and also recycling, exactly. And efficient and
He did a lot of work
Economical.
for Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. He has an office in Pittsburgh, and as I said, an office in Seattle, and now an office in, I believe, in Los Angeles, or perhaps San Francisco. I'm not sure which.
and also Philadelphia and still Wilkes-Barre.
He still has the Wilkes-Barre office, yes, and the Philadelphia office. He did the Pennsylvania Higher Education Building, and he did a remarkable building in the middle of New York, Manhattan, the Apple Store.
The Apple Store.
And he got to do the Apple Store because of his relationship with Bill Gates, and was commissioned to do that store. And it's a absolutely marvelous cube of glass, and it's empty. And it is, all of the sales are located on the floor below. You walk into this incredible space that is almost limitless. And as a matter of fact, for a retail store, it evidently sells more per square foot than any other retail store in the world.
Oh my goodness gracious.
And,
And it's nothing on ground level except a cube.
yeah,
A glass cube.
yeah, you have to go downstairs for all the products.
Wowee.
He also did the Seattle City Hall because of the work that he did for Gates. And he did a remarkable building called Coombs Point, which is a house. And it is a serene building on the edge of the prairie. And it just sits there gracefully, all made out of glass, with a wonderful floating roof. It's a fabulous building. Next we come to IMPay. Now, one of the things that makes these architects interesting is that they are traveling architects. They did work all over the country and, for that matter, all over the world. And IMPay is one of them. And he worked originally for Zuckendorf in New York.
Oh.
And that's where he got his claim to fame. And then he did the Pay Towers.
That's right, in Philadelphia.
The Society Hill Towers in Philadelphia. And they are very crisp, modern, classic modern, international style buildings. And then what is interesting about Pay is that he evolves into a much more sculptural architect than some of the other architects that we've looked at. He did the Johnson Museum on the National Mall, and he did the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame building in Cleveland. And that is the beginning of his actual sculptural sort of evolutionary work. It's a very sculptural building, and it's quite an interesting building just to go visit. He also did the Johnson Museum. He did the Johnson Museum in Cornell. That was one of his first commissions. He did the German Museum in Berlin, and he did the pyramid of the Louvre.
Oh my goodness.
The glass pyramid, which is really an
That's a
incredible
startling thing.
contrast to the existing building itself.
That's right.
And so he was breaking ground in that fashion, as evolving into a much more sculptural.
Yes, I'm familiar with
architect.
the museum in Berlin, and I would never have known that that was I.M. Pei.
Yeah, it's the beginning of his. Well, it's part of his evolutionary sculptural style, and possibly influenced by these next couple of architects who practiced in, of all places, Los Angeles. And they practiced in Los Angeles because, as we kind of noted in terms of the culture of a place, the culture of the place kind of dictates the kind of architecture that you end up doing. Well, Los Angeles has Disney World, Lucasfilms, and Spielberg.
Oh, that's right. Strange.
And they all go to the same cocktail parties. And they create bizarre environments. And no other than Errico and Moss creates really bizarre environments, as well as Gehry. And Errico and Moss has, interestingly enough, is one of the only architects of the current modern age who hasn't really traveled outside his own milieu.
Oh.
He does most of his work in Culver City, outside of Los Angeles.
But there's plenty of market there for bizarre
But the
architecture.
buildings are extraordinary buildings. The first one is called 3535 Hayden Avenue, a kind of conventional name. And then from there on, he starts producing buildings that are truly bizarre. And they're bizarrely called. The next building is Slash and Backlash. Backslash. Then he did what is called the Gateway Building, which is simply a building that is a gateway to another complex. And then he did a building called Pterodactyl, of all things. And in fact, I think his clients really enjoyed the bizarre nature of his buildings and the names of the buildings.
Because does pterodactyl look like a pterodactyl?
No, it looks like nothing we've ever imagined. And then he did a building called the Green Umbrella.
Which doesn't look like an umbrella,
Which
I
doesn't
assume.
look like an umbrella either. And another building called the Beehive, which kind of takes clues from Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum. It's a very curvy building. And quite frankly, what Errico and Moss is doing is pure sculpture by this point, rather than architecture. It's architecture that, I mean, it's sculpture that you actually live in, but it's more for the bizarre sculptural quality than anything else. And then finally, we have Frank Gehry.
Oh, now there's a name.
And-
It may be that a lot of our audience doesn't know Errico and Moss's name.
Yeah.
But they certainly know. They certainly know.
And he's had recently a lot of publicity because of the Philadelphia Museum.
Oh, that's right.
And he did it was an $85 million commission to redo the museum in Philadelphia. And it's one of his only restrained works.
I was going to say, again, as I wouldn't have known that the Berlin Museum was Pei, I never would have known the work at the Philadelphia Museum was Gehry, because it's so, as you say, restrained and traditional.
It is. And he really bent way over backwards to in deference to the museum itself. And at one point he had actually proposed, and they turned it down, cutting a big giant hole into the staircase. And
Interior or exterior?
putting a window in the staircase. And
on the exterior?
Yeah, and they decided not to do that.
Oh, so that would have given a view down the parkway.
Yeah, it would have, but I don't know whether the
No, I'm
client
not sure
turned them down
Philadelphians would have
or
liked
whether
that.
Philadelphians would really not enjoy the fact that their rocky staircase was now.
The rocky staircase, that's right. I'm sure that most Philadelphians were shocked when they heard that Gehry had been hired to do the renovations
Yeah, I
to
think.
the
Well, I
museum.
think they might have been. Yeah. So as most of the architects that we've seen, was one of his first works is the Gehry residence in Los Angeles.
Okay.
And Gehry is a transplanted American. He's actually born in Canada, but came down to Los Angeles very early on in his career. So I place him among the realm of the American architects rather than foreign architects.
Because all his work has come out of America.
Come out of America. But his first residence began to give clues of what he was really doing, because one of the main elements of the residence is a chain link fence. And that's really
how gorgeous.
The facade.
How gorgeous.
And it was a residence for himself. And it was one of his first projects. Then he began to really branch out and start to do extraordinarily sculptural buildings. One of which is the Music Project in Seattle, which is a museum for music. Why Seattle, I don't know. But in any event, another remarkable building that he did is the Chait Day Building, which is a giant set of binoculars.
The building is a set
and
of
it's an office building. For what reason the binoculars, who knows? One of the things that happened to American architecture was that once Bob Venturi decided that less is a bore, what happened was that all bets were off. And Frank Gehry and Eric Owen Moss evolved into more is more, and a lot more.
Exactly, a lot
more. The building that perhaps people most know is the Bilbao Museum. Bilbao, in Spain, and that museum kind of broke him into the museum mold of architecture. That's how he got the commission for the Philadelphia.
That's the Guggenheim.
Except that one thing I can't quite fathom is these museums that he does are a curator's nightmare, because there's not a flat surface to hang anything. And as opposed to Richard Meyer's work, his museums are all warehouse-like, so you can exhibit anything. Frank Gehry's is a work of art. Essentially, Frank Gehry's museums are, if you build it, they will come. As a matter of fact, before the museum, the Bilbao Museum, had any art in it, it had more visitors than the Louvre.
More visitors without art.
Yeah, and there was no art in the building. It was just people sort of checking off that they had visited the Bilbao Museum, and they could take pictures of it and show folks at home that they visited the museum. He did a bizarre building in Prague called Fred and Ginger, and because it looks like Fred Astaire and his
Ginger Rogers.
Ginger Rogers.
It looks like them dancing.
It looks like them dancing, and the Czechs began to call it the Fred and Ginger Building.
I guess I can.
And it's an apartment building of all things.
Oh my God! Well, I was about to say, I guess I can imagine a Fred and a building looking like Fred and Ginger more than I can imagine a building looking like binoculars.
Yeah.
So Moss and Gehry may be kind of trying to outdo each other. I don't know.
Well, they're both in the same place.
Yeah.
And I think that they're very much influenced by the movie makers.
Right.
And the fact that Lucas and Spielberg and so forth make bizarre environments.
Yeah.
I think very much influences their work as an architect of making bizarre environments.
Yeah, the aesthetic of the fantastical.
Yeah. So one of the buildings that Gehry's had a lot of criticism about some of his buildings because of the fact that they tend not to be functional. He did a building out at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, and they had to erect a railing around the building because the icicles would fall off the building and would injure the students.
Oh.
And the neighbors of the Disney Center in Los Angeles have sued Gehry and the center because the light reflects off its metal paneled skin so much that it affects the light in the office buildings and the heat in the office buildings.
Wow. Actually, I've kind of pushed you ahead. We haven't even talked about the Disney building, or maybe some others as well.
Well, the shaping of buildings. It's interesting, the evolution of modern architecture, because Ann Ting, who was a contemporary of Lu Con, had a theory about architecture and cultures, and essentially the theory was that and cultures and so forth. The theory was that architecture starts out, or art, very geometric and very orthographic, meaning plane-like. And you look at Mies van der Rohe and the beginning of the modern movement, and you see these very plane-like buildings. And then slowly but surely, as in the Renaissance, which begins the rebirth of knowledge and the all of the intellectual thought that's going into the Renaissance as a rebirth. The Renaissance starts with these very, very sedate temple-like buildings and evolves into Borromini and Baroque architecture, and then into Rococo architecture, which is off-the-wall classical architecture. And now we have very straightforward modern buildings, and slowly but surely evolving, as IMP did, into these incredibly sculptural buildings that are what I call Baroque, or the architecture of the bizarre.
Or maybe we've already jumped into the Rococo.
I'm not sure.
We still have that ahead of us?
But her theory also went with all forms of art. So, for instance, the symphony starts off very simple and then evolves into a symphony of 1,000, which is so expensive to perform that it can't be performed.
And it kind of self-implodes.
And it imploded. Mm-hmm. As did opera. It became so complex, and it ultimately ended up fostering other kinds of music, because no one could do opera anymore because it was so expensive.
Oh, okay.
And her theory goes along with governments, and you look at the rise and fall of Rome, from a simple republic to an empire, and then its collapse. And then you look at the monarchies of France and Germany and so forth, and they collapse. And what starts out as a new form of government, a democracy, has now, when you stand on the mall in Philadelphia and look at the Independence Hall, the city, state, and local government were all housed in those 3 buildings.
Oh, that's true.
And now look at what we have for the federal government. So Gehry's work evolves into this bizarre kind of work, and particularly as at Bard College, and also at the Disney Center, which is an opera house, but it is a bizarre building. And acoustically, I'm not sure how it works. But the Disney Center is a particularly sculptural product that comes through Gehry's own evolution of this modern sculptural kind of architecture. Where that goes, I don't know.
Well, that's what I was just
and
thinking.
Gehry couldn't do the buildings that he's doing without the ingenuity of the computer.
Well, that's true. That's so true.
And I don't know where the future of architecture goes with computer-driven architecture, because we're going to have robots building the buildings sooner or later. So it's going to be an interesting period
Yeah, I was going to ask you, but maybe you can't even answer because of technology that still lies ahead. I was going to ask you. I was going to say, you've described how we've taken this journey all the way to the Baroque, and what lies ahead.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's kind of it's tough to speculate because of the evolution of the computer.
Right.
And what the computer will do and what its influence will be on future architecture.
And the things that the computer can do now that none of us envisioned 20 years ago, I don't even know whether the Bill Gateses could have envisioned 20 years ago.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's very interesting.
So,
my goodness.
What has happened is that architects now don't have hometowns.
Yeah.
They travel worldwide to do their architecture. And I'm sure that America is going to be producing architects doing work in China. Who knows where we're
Well, I did notice as I was
going.
thinking about the whole course that we've taken here, the journey that we've taken, that it all started on the East Coast because, well, we're talking about American architecture. It all started on the East Coast and blossomed eventually in Philadelphia and Boston as a result of the Civil War and the need for machinery, et cetera, for the Civil War and for the recovery after the Civil War, because that's where the population was. And then it moved to Chicago, the midsection of the country, because that's where the population was expanding to. And then it moved to the West Coast, because it all had to do with where we were at the time. And now it encompasses not only the whole country, but the whole world.
Yep. And it's obviously driven by technology.
Yeah. Technology and demand. Demand for needs that need to be fulfilled.
Well, yep.
Uh-huh.
And, you know, the railroad helped to create some of the buildings that Frank Furness did because they were able to haul stone. And the railroad had a tremendous influence.
That's what I found fascinating about your book, that we all study architecture, we all look at architecture, and we just look at the buildings and talk about the building and talk about what the architect perhaps was trying to achieve. But what your book does explains why things happened. They happened because a particular region needed a particular thing, and so that region blossomed, its economy blossomed, its culture blossomed, and its need for architecture and architects blossomed, and so these particular architects had the opportunity to expand their practices and get great commissions because their region was blossoming. And that's the neat thing I like about your book, that it really goes from region to region, discussing what happened in Tulsa or Boston or Pasadena or wherever, to be the fertile ground for an Eero Saarinen, for instance, to come forward.
Yeah, technology drives the wealth, and the technology that America has created this enormous wealth, and the wealth has created the architecture.
Well, that's a good summary. That really is a good summary. I'm afraid we have to shut down this particular discussion here, but that wraps it up. That wealth and economics have driven the development of architecture.
And we certainly have enjoyed doing this series, and this is the last one. The next series will be on architecture. We have no idea.
That's right.
It's coming.
Stay tuned, so to speak.
Yeah, stay tuned.
So, in this series, we have explored the revolutionary inventions, historical events, and economic conditions that propelled Americans' most groundbreaking architects to rise in prominence. We thank Charles Dagit for bringing us insight from his highly respected book, The Groundbreakers, Architects in American History, Their Places and Times. And we thank you for being with us. We've really enjoyed it, and we hope you have too.